The Galactic Confederation's newest recruits strutted through the orbital station's corridors like they owned the universe. Commander Zethkar, a 7-foot-tall reptilian from the warrior planet Drakmor, led his squad of elite soldiers past the human quarters with barely concealed disgust. His elongated snout wrinkled as he caught sight of the Earth delegation preparing for their first joint military exercise. "Look at them," Zethkar hissed to his lieutenant, pointing a clawed finger toward the human women adjusting their equipment. Soft pink flesh, tiny frames, fragile bones. The males of their species are pathetic enough, but these females? They expect us to believe they can fight alongside true warriors? Lieutenant Vexter, a hulking creature from the ice world of Titan 7, rumbled his agreement. His species had evolved in gravity 3 times stronger than Earth's, making him a walking tank of muscle and bone. My research indicates human females lack even the basic physical capabilities of their own males. Their bone density is lower, muscle mass reduced. It's almost cruel that their leaders sent them here. The other members of the squad, warriors from a dozen different worlds where might made right and only the strongest survived, joined in the mockery. They'd all heard the stories about Earth's strange customs, how they allowed their weakest members to participate in combat roles. It went against everything they understood about natural selection and warrior culture. Captain Sarah Chun, the leader of Earth's delegation, noticed the alien stares and whispered conversations but kept her expression neutral. She'd dealt with prejudice before, both as a woman in the early days of Earth's space program and as a human, among species that viewed her people as newcomers to the galactic stage. Her team of 12 women, each selected from Earth's most elite military units, continued their preparations with professional focus. "They're watching us like we're some kind of zoo exhibit," whispered Sergeant Maria Rodriguez, checking the charge on her plasma rifle. She'd served 3 tours in the Martian colonial wars and had more combat experience than most of the alien warriors combined. But her service record meant nothing to species who judged worth by size and appearance alone. "Let them look," Chun replied quietly. Actions speak louder than words in any language. The joint exercise was scheduled to take place on Kepler 442b, a contested world where multiple species had competing claims. The scenario was simple. 2 teams would compete to capture and hold strategic positions across a varied terrain that included dense forests, rocky mountains, and abandoned settlements. Winners would gain significant influence in the Confederation's military planning committee. Zethkar's team had been assigned the designation Alpha Force, a title that suited their inflated egos perfectly. They spent their pre-mission briefing discussing how quickly they could eliminate the human team and claim victory. The betting pools among other Confederation species heavily favored the alien warriors, with odds running 50-1 against the humans. "I predict we'll have them eliminated within the first hour," boasted Sergeant Kriksta, an insectoid warrior whose species communicated through pheromone bursts that roughly translated to supreme confidence. "Their females will likely surrender the moment they encounter real opposition." But there was something the alien warriors didn't know about Earth's delegation, something that hadn't appeared in any of their intelligence briefings or cultural analyses. Each woman on the human team had been personally selected not just for their military skills, but for their connection to something far older and more dangerous than modern warfare. As Sarah Chun ran final equipment checks, she touched the small pendant hanging beneath her uniform, a twisted piece of iron that her grandmother had given her, along with stories that most people dismissed as folklore. Stories about the old ways, the old powers, and the old anger that slept in the hearts of women who had been underestimated for far too long. The other women carried similar talismans, each tied to ancestral traditions that stretched back to humanity's darkest and most primal roots. They were descendants of Viking shield maidens and Celtic warrior queens, of Amazon fighters and Scythian horse archers, of every culture that had ever taught its daughters to be more than what others expected. Dr. Elena Petrov, the team's combat medic, had been raised on her Russian grandmother's stories of the Baba Yaga, tales of a powerful witch who punished those who showed disrespect to women and children. What the stories hadn't mentioned was that Baba Yaga wasn't just one person, but a title passed down through generations of women who refused to be victims. As the transport ships prepared for departure to Kepler 442b, the alien warriors continued their jokes and crude predictions. They saw soft skin and assumed weakness. They saw smaller statures and assumed inferiority. They had no concept of the fury that could burn in hearts that had been dismissed and degraded for millennia. The humans boarded their transport in silence, each woman lost in her own preparations. Some meditated on combat techniques learned from the galaxy's finest instructors. Others focused on the advanced technology that Earth had contributed to the Confederation's arsenal. But all of them, consciously or not, were connecting to something deeper, an ancient rage that had been building for thousands of years, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. As their ship broke atmosphere and headed for the contested world, Sarah Chun looked out at the stars and smiled. The alien warriors expected to face Earth's women in battle. They had no idea they were about to encounter something far older and more terrible than any modern soldier. They were about to learn why, in the oldest stories humanity told, it was always a mistake to underestimate the women who walked between worlds. The Baba Yaga was coming, and she had 11 sisters with her. Kepler 442b's surface stretched out beneath storm-laden clouds, its terrain a patchwork of ancient forests, jagged mountain ranges, and the skeletal remains of long-dead civilizations. The planet had been fought over by 3 different species before the Confederation claimed it as neutral territory, and the scars of those conflicts dotted the landscape like old wounds. Commander Zethkar's Alpha Force touched down at the northern landing zone with typical Drekmorian swagger. Their transport ship's engines hadn't even finished cooling before the alien warriors were deploying in textbook formation, weapons ready, scanning for immediate threats. Each member of the team moved with the fluid precision of apex predators, their various technological advantages on full display. Thermal imaging shows no immediate hostiles, reported Vexter, his cybernetic eye replacements providing detailed battlefield analysis. The human team landed approximately 12 kilometers south. At their expected pace, first contact should occur near the central ruins within 4 hours. Zethkar nodded, his forked tongue tasting the air for chemical signatures. The planet's atmosphere was thick with the scent of decay and old violence, a combination that made his warrior instincts sing with anticipation. Perfect. We'll establish our primary base at the mountain overlook and pick them off as they approach. This will be over before the Confederation observers even finish their initial reports. Meanwhile, the human team had made planetfall in a completely different manner. Instead of the aggressive deployment typical of Confederation forces, they had landed quietly, almost invisibly. Their transport had used stealth technology that Sarah Chun's team had specifically requested, systems based on Earth's most advanced military research, but modified with techniques that seemed to draw from much older sources. Mists rolling in faster than the weather reports predicted, observed Lieutenant Amanda Blackwood, whose grandmother had taught her to read signs that had nothing to do with meteorological instruments. She was descended from a line of Scottish Highland women who had fought alongside their clans for centuries. And something in the planetary atmosphere felt familiar to her in ways she couldn't quite explain. Dr. Petrov was already setting up what appeared to be a standard field medical station. But the items she unpacked included several objects that wouldn't be found in any military manual. Bundles of dried herbs that her babushka had insisted she carry. Small carved figures made from wood that had never seen sunlight. And a mortar and pestle carved from stone that predated written history. The old ways work better on worlds like this, she explained quietly to Sergeant Kim Park, who was watching with fascination. Places where the boundary between life and death has been worn thin by violence. The technology helps, but some things require older solutions. The human team moved through the planet's lower forests like shadows, each woman falling naturally into patterns of movement that seemed to flow with the landscape itself. They weren't just using their advanced training, They were tapping into instincts that ran deeper than any military academy could teach. Instincts inherited from ancestors who had survived by being smarter, faster, and infinitely more cunning than those who underestimated them. Back at the alien base camp, confidence was running high. The team had established perfect defensive positions with clear sight lines across the approaches to their chosen strategic objective, a massive, crystalline formation that served as the exercise's primary capture point. Their equipment was top-tier Confederation standard. Their individual capabilities were beyond question, and their tactical advantages were overwhelming. Energy signatures indicate the humans are still moving through the lower forest, Krixta reported, her compound eyes analyzing readouts from orbital surveillance. Their pace is extremely slow. They appear to be having difficulty with the terrain. This observation prompted another round of derisive laughter from Alpha Force, the idea that Earth's females couldn't handle a simple cross-country march confirmed everything they believed about human weakness. They settled in to wait, confident that their opponents would stumble into their kill zone within hours. What they didn't realize was that the human team wasn't struggling with the terrain, they were learning from it. Each woman was using techniques passed down through generations of survivors, reading the land in ways that no technological sensor could match. They were finding paths that wouldn't show up on any map, identifying resources that their ancestors would have recognized immediately, and most importantly, they were preparing for a kind of warfare that the Confederation had never encountered. As evening approached, something began to change in the forests of Kepler 442b, the mist that had been gathering all day started to move in patterns that had nothing to do with wind or weather. Animals that had been quiet since the military forces arrived began to stir, but their calls didn't sound quite natural. And in clearings scattered throughout the woods, small fires began to burn, fires that cast shadows in directions that didn't match the flames. Dr. Petrov worked by one such fire, grinding herbs with her ancient mortar while speaking words in a language that predated Russia by millennia. The other women had established similar positions throughout the forest, each one drawing on traditions that their families had preserved despite centuries of suppression and ridicule. "The grandmother spirits are listening," Maria Rodriguez whispered into her communicator, using a channel that the alien technology couldn't detect. Her own grandmother had been a curandera in New Mexico, a healer who knew that some battles required more than bullets and determination. Sarah June stood at the center of their scattered formation, feeling the power beginning to build around them. This wasn't magic in the sense that most people understood it. It was something far older and more practical. It was the accumulated wisdom of countless generations of women who had learned to survive in a world that tried to erase them. And it was finally ready to remind the universe that some forces should never be dismissed. The alien warriors, secure in their mountain stronghold, had no idea that the mist surrounding their position wasn't natural. They couldn't detect the presence moving through it, couldn't sense the ancient anger that was taking shape in the darkness below them. They were about to discover that Earth's women hadn't come to play by Confederation rules. The Baba Yaga had arrived on Kepler 442b, and she was hungry. The first sign that something had gone wrong came at 0347 hours, when Sentinel Drakmoon failed to report in from his perimeter watch. Commander Zethkar initially dismissed it as a communication glitch. The planet's unusual electromagnetic properties were known to interfere with standard Confederation equipment. But when the backup Sentinel also went silent, a cold dread began to creep into the alien commander's thoughts. "Vexler, take a squad and investigate the southern perimeter," Zethkar ordered, his voice betraying none of the unease that was building in his chest. "Probably just equipment failure, but we maintain protocol." The hulking lieutenant gathered 2 other warriors and moved into the mist-shrouded darkness beyond their defensive perimeter. Their thermal imaging revealed nothing unusual. Their motion sensors remained quiet, and their atmospheric readings showed only the expected baseline signatures. For 20 minutes, they conducted a thorough sweep of the area where Drakmoon should have been stationed. They found his equipment neatly arranged in a small clearing as if he had simply set everything down and walked away. His weapon was fully charged, his armor showed no signs of damage, and his communicator was still functioning perfectly. But of the warrior himself, there was no trace, no sign of struggle, no tracks leading away from the position, no indication of what had happened to a soldier trained from birth to be nearly impossible to kill. "This makes no sense," muttered Sergeant Kriksta, her compound eyes scanning the area with increasing agitation. "Drakmorian warriors don't just vanish. His scent trail ends right here, like he simply ceased to exist." What none of them noticed was the small pile of ashes scattered near the base of an ancient tree. Ashes that still held the faint warmth of something that had burned completely and utterly. Nor did they see the carved symbols that had been etched into the tree's bark, symbols that would have been familiar to any human grandmother who still remembered the old stories dot by dawn. 3 more sentries had disappeared in the same inexplicable manner. Each time, their equipment remained behind, undamaged and functional, while the warriors themselves had simply vanished without leaving any trace that Confederation technology could detect. The remaining members of Alpha Force had pulled back to their central position, weapons ready, scanning constantly for an enemy they couldn't identify or understand. "Could be some kind of advanced stealth technology," suggested weapons specialist Gorvak, trying to maintain the facade of rational military thinking even as primal fears began to gnaw at his confidence. "Maybe the humans have capabilities we weren't briefed on." But Zethkar-S training included extensive intelligence on Earth's technological capabilities, and nothing in their arsenal should have been able to achieve what they were witnessing. Human stealth technology was competent but hardly revolutionary, and their weapon systems, while effective, were based on principles that every Confederation species understood. As the morning progressed, things became worse. The mist that had seemed like simple weather the night before refused to burn off under the alien sun. Instead, it grew thicker, moving in patterns that defied atmospheric physics. Shapes moved within it, shapes that appeared human at first glance but seemed wrong when observed more carefully. Too tall in some places, too angular in others. As if someone was wearing humanity as an ill-fitting disguise. "Contact! Multiple hostiles approaching from the east," shouted Lieutenant Vexter, his enhanced vision catching movement in the fog. The remaining 8 members of Alpha Force immediately shifted to defensive positions, their weapons trained on the approaching figures, but when they opened fire, their energy beams passed through empty mist. The shapes they had seen weren't there, or perhaps had never been there at all. Their sensors registered no targets, no heat signatures, no mass displacement, nothing that should have been visible to eyes trained to detect threats across a dozen different spectrums. The psychological warfare was masterful in its simplicity. The human team wasn't engaging in direct confrontation. They were using the planet itself as a weapon, combined with techniques that their enemies couldn't comprehend or counter. Each woman had spent the night preparing the battlefield in ways that drew from traditions far older than space travel. Dr. Petrov had been particularly busy, using her medical knowledge, combined with her grandmother's teachings to create compounds that didn't exist in any Confederation database. Herbal mixtures that could be burned to create hallucinations in specific alien physiologies. Powders that could be scattered to disrupt electronic sensors, and most importantly, preparations that could temporarily stop a heart without leaving any technological signature. The missing sentries weren't dead, they were experiencing something far stranger. Each warrior who had vanished had encountered one of the human team in circumstances that shouldn't have been possible. They had been approached by figures that their minds couldn't quite process. Women who seemed to shift and change when not observed directly, speaking in voices that bypassed the ears entirely and whispered directly into the brain. Some had been offered choices that no warrior should have faced, given opportunities to walk away from conflicts they didn't understand. Others had been shown visions of their own deaths, experienced futures where their arrogance led to consequences that stretched far beyond a simple military exercise. All of them had been broken down psychologically by encounters with something their training had never prepared them for. They were being held in a makeshift camp deeper in the forest, conscious but catatonic, their minds struggling to process experiences that contradicted everything they believed about reality. Dr. Petrov checked on them periodically, ensuring they remained physically unharmed while their worldviews underwent complete reconstruction. The old stories were true, she murmured to Amanda Blackwood, as they observed the alien warrior's vacant stares. There really are some things that shouldn't be dismissed as folklore. Our grandmothers knew what they were preserving. Back at the alien base, panic was beginning to set in. Half their force had vanished without explanation. Their equipment was malfunctioning in ways that suggested systematic sabotage, and the enemy they had come to defeat remained completely invisible despite all their technological advantages. Worse, they were beginning to see things that couldn't be there, shadows that moved independently of their sources, faces in the mist that belonged to no species they recognized, and worst of all, the growing certainty that they were being watched by something that found their fear amusing. Commander Zethkar tried to maintain order, but he could see the doubt growing in his remaining warriors' eyes. They had come to this world expecting to humiliate weak humans in a simple military exercise. Instead, they were facing something that challenged the very foundations of their understanding about strength, warfare, and the nature of power itself. The Baba Yaga had come for those who mocked her children, and she was just getting started. By midday, the remaining 4 members of Alpha Force had barricaded themselves inside the crystalline formation they were supposed to be defending. Their once proud formation had collapsed into a desperate defensive huddle, weapons pointed outward at threats they couldn't see or understand. The sophisticated alien warriors, bred for conquest across a dozen worlds, were now jumping at shadows and firing at phantoms. "This isn't warfare," Zethkar hissed, his reptilian features twisted with a combination of rage and growing terror. "This is some kind of psychological manipulation. Humans aren't capable of this level of mental warfare." But even as he spoke, his voice lacked the conviction it had held just hours earlier. The evidence of his own eyes was contradicting everything he believed about human capabilities. His sensors showed clear readings, his training provided logical explanations, but the reality around him refused to conform to either science or military doctrine. Lieutenant Vexler, the massive warrior from the high-gravity world, was experiencing something that his species had never encountered in their brutal evolutionary history: genuine helplessness. His enhanced strength meant nothing against enemies he couldn't touch. His superior technology was useless against attacks that bypassed physical reality entirely. For the first time in his life, he was forced to confront the possibility that raw power might not be enough. "Commander," he rumbled, his voice carrying undertones of doubt that would have been unthinkable a day earlier. "What if we're not facing humans anymore? What if they've become something else?" The question hung in the air like a challenge to everything the alien forces believed about the universe. In their cultures, strength was straightforward, power was measurable, and victory belonged to whoever could bring the most force to bear. The concept that their enemies might be operating according to completely different rules was more terrifying than any weapon outside the crystalline shelter. The human team was indeed operating according to different rules that had been refined over thousands of years by women, who had learned to survive in societies that considered them expendable. Each member of the team was drawing on traditions that had been dismissed as superstition by modern civilization, but which contained practical knowledge about psychological warfare, herbal chemistry, and the manipulation of human perception. Sarah Chun moved through the mist-shrouded landscape like a wraith, her movements guided by techniques her Chinese grandmother had taught her during long afternoons in a garden that most people would have considered perfectly ordinary. But those sessions had included lessons about reading the flow of qi through landscapes, understanding how spiritual energy could be redirected and focused, and most importantly, recognizing when an enemy had already defeated themselves through their own assumptions. "They're breaking faster than expected," she whispered into the secure communication channel that connected her team. 8 hours of psychological pressure, and they're already showing signs of complete tactical collapse. The response came from Maria Rodriguez, whose position near the alien base allowed her to observe their increasingly erratic behavior. My grandmother always said that bullies become cowards the moment they realize their victims can fight back. These warriors have never faced anyone who refused to play by their rules. What the alien forces couldn't understand was that the human team wasn't using advanced technology or superior firepower. They were employing something far more sophisticated. They were using the enemy's own preconceptions as weapons. Every assumption the alien warriors had made about human weakness was being turned against them, creating a psychological maze where their greatest strengths became their most crippling vulnerabilities. Dr. Petrov had spent hours preparing compounds that targeted specific alien physiologies in ways that would never occur to CONVNTIONAL military thinking. Her grandmother's knowledge of herbalism, combined with her medical training, had allowed her to create substances that could induce specific types of hallucinations in reptilian nervous systems, disrupt the electromagnetic senses of cybernetically enhanced species, and trigger primitive fear responses in creatures who believed they had evolved beyond such weaknesses. But the chemical warfare was only one layer of the assault. Each woman on the team was contributing elements that drew from their own ancestral traditions. Amanda Blackwood's Scottish heritage included knowledge of psychological warfare that Highland clans had used against Roman legions. Kim Park's Korean grandmother had taught her about invisible strikes that defeated enemies without direct confrontation. Every cultural tradition represented on the human team contributed techniques that the Galactic military establishment had never encountered. The aliens' equipment failures weren't random malfunctions. They were the result of carefully planned sabotage that used principles of technological disruption that combined quantum mechanics with what most people would dismiss as folk magic. Circuits failed when exposed to specific electromagnetic frequencies generated by devices that looked like simple wooden flutes. Sensor arrays became unreliable when certain patterns of herbs were burned upwind of their positions. Communication systems developed static when particular songs were hummed at precisely calibrated intervals. The boundary between science and what people call magic has always been smaller than most people realize, explained Lieutenant Jessica Rivers to the orbital observers who were monitoring the exercise with increasing confusion. Her background included a doctorate in theoretical physics and a childhood spent learning traditional Cherokee healing practices from her grandmother. Both are ways of manipulating natural forces through understanding and intent. As afternoon faded toward evening, the psychological pressure on the remaining alien warriors intensified. They began to see their missing comrades in the mist, but these figures seemed wrong somehow. Their eyes held accusations. Their movements carried messages of betrayal and abandonment. The shapes called out in familiar voices, begging for rescue while simultaneously warning against approaching the human positions. "Don't listen to them," Zethkar commanded. But his own voice was beginning to crack under the strain. "Hallucinations? Technological tricks. We're trained to resist mental manipulation." But their training had been designed to resist conventional, psychological warfare conducted through recognizable technological means. None of their preparation had included defense against enemies, who could reach into their subconscious minds and activate fears that predated their species' first steps toward civilization. The human team was using techniques that bypassed rational thought entirely, striking directly at the primitive terror that lived in the deepest parts of every thinking being's brain. As darkness fell over Kepler 442b, the four remaining alien warriors huddled inside their crystalline fortress, weapons ready but hands shaking, sensors active but providing information that contradicted their own perceptions. They had come to this world as conquerors, expecting easy victory over weak human females. Instead, they were discovering that they had challenged something far older and more dangerous than any modern military force. They were learning why, in the oldest stories that thinking beings told, it was always a mistake to underestimate the ones who walked between worlds, the ones who remembered the old ways. The ones who carried the accumulated rage of every woman who had ever been dismissed as weak. The Baba Yaga circled her prey, and the hunt was almost over. The final confrontation began not with the clash of weapons or the thunder of artillery, but with the sound of laughter. Soft, feminine laughter that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, echoing off the crystalline walls of the alien stronghold in harmonies that no single voice could produce. The remaining 4 members of Alpha Force pressed their backs against each other, weapons drawn, as the sound surrounded them like a living thing. "Show yourselves." Zethkar roared into the darkness, his voice carrying all the desperation of a predator who had suddenly realized he was prey. "Face us like warriors." The response came not in words but in change. The mist that had plagued them all day began to coalesce into shapes, and this time there was no doubt about what they were seeing. 12 figures emerged from the fog, moving with a fluid grace that seemed to mock the concept of physical limitations. They were clearly human women, but something about them was wrong, or perhaps too right. As if they had become more themselves than should have been possible, Sarah Chun stepped forward first, and Zethkar's trained eye immediately cataloged everything that should have made her an easy target. She stood barely 5.5 feet tall, her frame slender even by human standards, her visible muscle mass a fraction of what any Confederation warrior possessed. By every measure his culture used to evaluate threats, she should have been negligible, but when she looked at him, Zethkar felt something he had never experienced before, the absolute certainty that he was facing something that could destroy him without effort. Her eyes held depths that seemed to stretch back through geological time, carrying the accumulated weight of every woman who had ever been underestimated, dismissed, or threatened by those who confused physical size with actual power. "You wanted to face us?" she said, her voice carrying clearly despite being barely above a whisper. "Here we are. The weak little human females you've been mocking for the past 2 days." Dr. Petrov moved to stand beside her, and the alien warrior's sensors immediately began registering impossible readings. The woman's body temperature was fluctuating in patterns that suggested she was somehow burning from within, but her skin showed no signs of heat damage. More disturbing, the electromagnetic field around her was shifting in frequencies that their equipment couldn't classify, creating interference patterns that made their targeting systems completely unreliable. "In my grandmother's stories," the doctor said conversationally, "the Baba Yaga always gave her enemies a choice. She would offer them one chance to acknowledge their mistakes and change their ways. Those who accepted her mercy were allowed to leave, wiser but unharmed. Those who chose pride over wisdom." She didn't need to finish the sentence. The implications hung in the air like the scent of smoke from a distant fire. Lieutenant Vexter, the massive warrior whose genetic modifications had made him nearly indestructible by conventional standards, found himself backing away from women who collectively weighed less than he did. Every instinct his species had developed over millions of years of evolution was screaming warnings that his rational mind couldn't understand. These creatures registered as prey by every physical measure, but his deepest survival instincts were treating them as apex predators. "This is impossible," he muttered, his enhanced vocal cords producing harmonics that betrayed his growing panic. "You're just humans, females. You have no enhanced genetics, no cybernetic modifications, no advanced biotechnology. How are you doing this?" Maria Rodriguez smiled, and the expression was simultaneously beautiful and terrifying. "You're thinking about this wrong. You've spent so much time measuring strength in terms of muscle mass and technological advancement that you forgot about the power that comes from having nothing left to lose." She gestured toward the other women, and for a moment the alien warriors could see them as they truly were, not just modern soldiers, but the inheritors of thousands of years of accumulated knowledge passed down through generations of women, who had survived by being smarter, more resilient, and infinitely more creative than those who tried to destroy them. Every one of us is descended from women who faced impossible odds and found ways to not just survive, but to make their enemies regret underestimating them. We carry their knowledge, their techniques, their fury, and their absolute refusal to be dismissed by creatures who think power comes from size alone. The alien weapons were useless now, not because of any technological interference, but because the warriors holding them were paralyzed by a fear that bypassed rational thought entirely. They were experiencing the primal terror of predators who had suddenly realized they were face to face with something higher up the food chain, something that had been playing with them rather than fighting them. Amanda Blackwood spoke next, her Scottish accent carrying undertones that seemed to reach directly into the listeners' minds. Your cultures measure strength by how much destruction you can cause, how many enemies you can defeat through brute force. But real power isn't about breaking things. It's about understanding how they work and knowing exactly where to apply pressure to make them break themselves. The truth hit the alien warriors like a physical blow. They hadn't been defeated by superior technology or overwhelming firepower. They had been systematically dismantled by enemies who understood psychology, chemistry, electromagnetic theory, and a dozen other sciences that their own cultures had dismissed as irrelevant to warfare. Worse, these sciences had been combined with traditional knowledge that predated space travel by millennia, creating a form of warfare that their military academies had never imagined. "You could have simply defeated us in direct combat," Sergeant Krixta whispered, her compound eyes darting between the 12 women, who had somehow transformed a routine military exercise into a nightmare of psychological warfare. Why this elaborate demonstration? Sarah Chian's expression softened slightly, and for a moment she looked like nothing more than a tired soldier at the end of a long deployment. Because defeating you wouldn't have taught you anything. You would have explained it away as human luck or Confederation politics or a dozen other excuses that let you keep believing that physical strength is the only measure of worth. She gestured toward the mist-shrouded landscape where 8 alien warriors remained in catatonic shock, their minds struggling to process encounters that had shattered their fundamental assumptions about reality. This way you'll remember. You'll know that there are forces in this universe that you don't understand, powers that can't be measured by your standards, and enemies who become more dangerous when you dismiss them as weak. Dr. Petrov stepped forward, holding a small vial of liquid that seemed to shift colors in the alien torchlight. "The choice is still yours. Accept that your assumptions were wrong, acknowledge that strength comes in forms you never learned to recognize, and we'll end this exercise with a lesson learned rather than a tragedy recorded." The alternative remained unspoken, but the implications were clear. The human team had demonstrated their ability to neutralize superior forces through methods that the Confederation couldn't counter or even fully understand. They had turned the aliens' greatest strengths, their confidence, their technological advantages, their physical superiority, into weaknesses that could be exploited by enemies who understood the true nature of power the Baba Yaga had given her. Traditional choice. And the response would determine whether this encounter ended with wisdom or with consequences that would echo across the galaxy. The silence stretched between the two forces like a bridge waiting to be crossed. Commander Zethkar's reptilian features twisted through a dozen different expressions as his mind wrestled with concepts that challenged everything he had been taught about power, warfare, and the natural order of the universe. His weapon remained in his hands, but it felt heavier now, weighted down by the growing understanding that it had never been the source of his strength. Around him, his remaining warriors waited for orders that he couldn't give. How do you command a retreat from an enemy that exists as much in your mind as on the battlefield? How do you surrender to opponents who had already demonstrated their ability to reshape reality according to rules you didn't understand? Dr. Petrov watched the alien commander's internal struggle with something approaching sympathy. Her grandmother had taught her that the moment of choice was always the most painful part of the Baba Yaga's lesson. Pride and wisdom warred within every person who reached this crossroads, and the battle was rarely easy. "Your cultures have a concept of honorable surrender," she said gently. "Recognition that continuing a fight serves no purpose beyond adding to the casualties. This is one of those moments. Vexthur, the massive warrior whose genetic enhancements had made him nearly invulnerable to conventional attacks, slowly lowered his weapon. The movement seemed to cost him enormous effort, as if he were fighting against the programming of his entire evolutionary history. But when he looked at the human women surrounding him, he no longer saw weak prey. He saw something that his deepest instincts recognized as worthy of respect. "We yield," he said, the words scraping against his vocal cords like shattered glass. "We acknowledge that our assumptions about human capabilities were insufficient." One by one, the other alien warriors followed his example. Weapons were lowered, targeting systems deactivated, and defensive postures abandoned. It wasn't defeat in the traditional sense, it was something far more profound. It was the recognition that they had been playing an entirely different game than their opponents. Using rules that had been obsolete before the first shot was fired, Sarah Chun nodded. And with that simple gesture, the oppressive atmosphere that had dominated Kepler 442 began to lift. The mist that had seemed so threatening started to dissipate under natural weather patterns. The electromagnetic interference that had plagued their sensors faded away. The planet itself seemed to exhale, releasing tensions that had been building for hours. "The exercise is concluded," she said into her communicator, addressing the Confederation observers who had been monitoring the situation with increasing bewilderment. "All participants are alive and unharmed. We're ready for extraction and debriefing." But before the transport ships arrived, there was still work to be done. The 8 alien warriors who had been psychologically neutralized needed to be restored to functional consciousness. And that process required the same careful attention to detail that had rendered them catatonic in the first place. Dr. Petrov led the effort, using combinations of medical science and traditional techniques to guide the affected warriors back to awareness. Each one required individual attention, as the specific nature of their psychological breakdown varied according to their species, their personal history, and the particular fears that had been activated during their encounters with the human team. "The mind is like any other organ," she explained to Amanda Blackwood as they worked too. Restore an insectoid warrior whose compound eyes had been staring blankly for hours. When it's subjected to experiences beyond its normal parameters, it goes into protective shutdown. The key is providing a safe pathway back to normal function. The process took several hours, during which the alien warriors gradually returned to awareness with expressions of confusion, embarrassment, and growing understanding. None of them could clearly remember what had happened during their encounters with individual human team members, but all of them carried the unmistakable knowledge that their fundamental assumptions about the universe had been permanently altered. As the extraction ships descended through Kepler 442b's atmosphere, representatives from a dozen different Confederation species gathered in the orbital station's main briefing room. The footage and sensor data from the exercise had been transmitted in real time, but the observers were still struggling to understand what they had witnessed. "Explain to me again how 12 human females neutralized an elite warrior unit without firing a single shot," demanded Admiral Vekaran, the Confederation's chief military strategist. Her own species had evolved from pack hunters on a world where weakness meant death, and the concept of nonviolent victory was almost incomprehensible to her. The human delegation's response was carefully prepared. They had known that this moment would come, that their demonstration would raise questions that had implications far beyond a simple military exercise. The techniques they had revealed were only the beginning of what Earth's combined cultural traditions could offer to galactic civilization, but they needed to be introduced carefully to avoid disrupting the delicate balance of power that kept the Confederation stable. "We use psychological warfare techniques combined with advanced understanding of alien physiology and environmental manipulation," Sarah Chun explained. "Our approach was based on the principle that every opponent's greatest strength can become their greatest weakness when properly understood and redirected." It was a true answer, but deliberately incomplete. The full explanation would have required discussions. of concepts that most Confederation species weren't ready to accept. The idea that what they dismissed as primitive folklore often contained sophisticated scientific knowledge, that technological advancement wasn't the only measure of civilizational development, and that power structures based purely on physical dominance were inherently unstable. Over the following weeks, word of what had happened on Kepler 442b spread throughout the galaxy's military communities. The story grew in the telling, as military stories always do, but the core message remained consistent. Earth's women had achieved something that no other Confederation species had managed. They had defeated superior opponents without relying on superior firepower, genetic modifications, or technological advantages. More importantly, they had done it in a way that transformed their enemies rather than simply destroying them. Commander Zethkar and his team returned to their homeworlds as changed individuals, carrying with them a new understanding of strength that began to influence their entire cultures. Approach to warfare and diplomacy, the ripple effects were immediate and profound. Military academies across the Confederation began incorporating human, psychological warfare techniques into their curricula. Diplomatic corps started requesting human advisors for negotiations with traditionally hostile species. And most significantly, the casual dismissal of primitive cultural traditions began to give way to genuine scientific interest in alternative approaches to problem solving. But perhaps the most important change was the simplest one. No one ever again made the mistake of assuming that Earth's women were weak. The Baba Yaga had taught her lesson well, and the galaxy had learned to listen when the grandmother spoke. 6 months after the Kepler 442b exercise, the galaxy had changed in ways that no military strategist could have predicted. The Confederation's council chambers, once dominated by the roars and posturing of warrior species competing for dominance, had become places where quieter voices were finally being heard. Representatives who had spent decades being dismissed as weak were now consulted on matters of critical importance, and the old assumption that bigger meant better was crumbling under the weight of demonstrated evidence to the contrary. Commander Zethkar stood before the Galactic Military Academy's most prestigious graduating class, his reptilian features bearing scars that had nothing to do with physical combat. The 8 weeks he had spent in psychological rehabilitation after Kepler 442b had transformed him from an arrogant warrior into something far more dangerous, a leader who understood that true strength came from knowledge, adaptability, and the wisdom to recognize when his assumptions were wrong. "The most important lesson I can teach you," he told the assembled cadets from dozens of different species, "is that the enemy who appears weakest may be the one most capable of destroying you. Not through brute force, but through understanding you better than you understand yourself." His lecture had become the most requested presentation in the Academy's history, drawing attendance from senior officers who had previously dismissed human psychological warfare as primitive trickery. The recordings were studied throughout the Confederation's military establishment not for their tactical insights, but for their philosophical implications about the nature of power itself. Back on Earth, Dr. Elena Petrov had returned to her research laboratory, but her work had taken on new dimensions that bridged the gap between advanced medical science and traditional healing practices. The Confederation's Xenobiology Department was funding her studies into the therapeutic applications of what they carefully termed ethnobotanical knowledge systems, and her grandmother's herb garden had become one of the most scientifically significant locations in human space. The old women always knew more than they were given credit for, she explained to a joint committee of human and alien researchers. "We're not discovering new science. We're rediscovering ancient science that was preserved in forms our technological civilization didn't recognize as valid." The implications were staggering. Across the galaxy, species that had dismissed folklore and traditional knowledge as obsolete superstition were beginning systematic studies of their own ancestral practices. The Drakmorian war songs that Zethkar's people had considered purely ceremonial turned out to contain sophisticated psychological conditioning techniques. The meditation practices of the peaceful Zenthari included mathematical principles that could be applied to faster-than-light navigation. The seemingly simple stories that elder members of various species told their young contained compressed information about everything from xenopsychology to quantum mechanics. Sarah Chion found herself in the unexpected position of being the Confederation's first director of integrated warfare studies, a department that had been created specifically to develop the techniques her team had demonstrated. But her greatest satisfaction came from watching how the success on Kepler 442b had changed the way human women were perceived throughout galactic society. "We didn't set out to start a revolution," she told the packed auditorium at the Galactic Strategic Institute. "We just got tired of being underestimated by people who confused physical size with actual capability. But sometimes the most effective revolutions are the ones that happen accidentally." The changes went far beyond military applications. Throughout Confederation space, species that had been marginalized due to their physical characteristics, technological limitations, or unconventional social structures were being invited to contribute their unique perspectives to problems that had previously been considered solved. The galaxy was discovering that its greatest resource wasn't raw materials or energy sources, but the accumulated wisdom of billions of thinking beings who had each developed different solutions to the challenges of existence. Maria Rodriguez had become the Confederation's leading expert on asymmetric conflict resolution, teaching alien diplomats how to transform confrontations from tests of strength into opportunities for mutual understanding. Her techniques, rooted in her grandmother's teachings about healing community visions, were being applied to territorial disputes that had seemed intractable for centuries. "The secret isn't winning," she explained to a gathering of Confederation ambassadors. "It's redefining what victory looks like until everyone involved can achieve it simultaneously." But perhaps the most profound changes were happening at the individual level. Throughout the galaxy, beings who had been taught to measure their worth by their ability to dominate, others were learning about different forms of strength. Young aliens were studying human literature, not for its entertainment value, but for its insights into psychological resilience and social adaptation. Military academies were requiring courses in what they formerly called alternative conflict resolution, but which their students privately referred to as grandmother studies. The Baba Yaga had become more than a human folktale. She had become a galactic symbol for the power that exists in those who refuse to be diminished by others' expectations. Alien species had begun developing their own versions of the story, adapting it to their own cultural contexts while preserving its essential message about the danger of underestimating anyone based on superficial characteristics. Lieutenant Amanda Blackwood, now serving as a cultural exchange coordinator, found herself teaching Scottish Highland fighting techniques to warrior species who had initially requested the training as a curiosity. What they discovered was that the seemingly primitive methods contained sophisticated principles of leverage, timing, and psychological manipulation that were applicable to conflicts across any number of technological levels. Every culture that has survived long enough to reach space has had to solve the same fundamental problems, she explained to her mixed species classes. The solutions may look different on the surface, but the underlying principles are often remarkably similar. When we share that knowledge instead of hoarding it, everyone becomes stronger. The final vindication came when the Confederation faced its first major external threat since the Kepler 442b exercise. A hostile force from outside the galaxy had begun probing the outer systems, using conventional military tactics that should have given them overwhelming advantages over Confederation forces. The invasion fleet was larger, better armed, and more technologically advanced than anything the member species could field individually, but the response wasn't individual. Drawing on techniques that had been developed from the human team's demonstration, the Confederation deployed a coordinated defense that used each species' unique capabilities in ways that multiplied their effectiveness exponentially. Psychological warfare specialists worked alongside conventional military units. Cultural anthropologists provided insights that allowed defenders to predict enemy behavior. Traditional knowledge keepers contributed solutions to logistical problems that had stumped advanced computer systems. The invasion was repelled not through superior firepower, but through superior understanding of how different approaches to problem-solving could be combined into something greater than the sum of their parts. The external threat retreated, carrying with them reports about a galactic civilization that had somehow become more dangerous by becoming more collaborative. In the quiet aftermath of victory, Sarah Chun stood in her grandmother's garden back on Earth, tending to plants whose medicinal properties were now being studied by xenobotanists throughout the galaxy. The small space that had once been dismissed as an old woman's hobby had become the template for similar preservation efforts on dozens of worlds. Did you know this would happen? She asked the memory of the woman who had taught her that strength came in many forms. Did you know that sharing the old stories would change everything? The answer came not in words but in understanding. The grandmothers had always known that their knowledge would be needed someday. They had preserved it not because they expected immediate recognition, but because they understood that wisdom was too valuable to be lost to the arrogance of any single generation. The galaxy had learned to listen when the Baba Yaga spoke, and the universe was better for it. The old ways had found new applications. Ancient wisdom had proven its relevance to modern challenges. And those who had been dismissed as weak had demonstrated the kind of strength that transformed civilizations. The story was over, but its lessons would echo across the stars for generations to come. And in gardens and kitchens and quiet corners throughout the galaxy, grandmothers smiled and continued teaching their children that there was more to power than anyone imagined, waiting for the day when those lessons would be needed again.